Today's meeting is to talk about the development code, which is happening in a parallel track to the general plan update. General plan update is almost done in the sense that the next meeting will be to begin the process of discussion and adoption. This process is a little over half done, and we're delivering another module of it to discuss today. This is a very meaty module. So let's go ahead. We're going to run through a short presentation of the highlights of this and then just throw it open for discussion. But I think it will be easier to ask the questions you want to ask if we get through this presentation. So a little bit about the project, a little bit about, here we go, general plan and development code update are the two parts of it. Let's go to the next slide. Here's how the timeline works for this part, the development code overview, just because we haven't been here for a few months. We started off with just initial interviews and listening to what the city wanted done. There was a concern when we began about code enforcement options, and so we did some work on that topic. We did an evaluation and came and described what we found when we looked through the Lake Havasu City Development Code, zoning, and subdivision controls. And then we are at steps 4 and 5. We have divided the work into 3 modules. The first one dealt with administration and procedures. We were here 5 months ago, I think, to present that, and it's been posted. It is about the processes. What kind of people need to apply for permits, rezonings, applications, how are they processed, how does enforcement happen? That was done in the fall of 2014. The second module is this one. This is zone districts and permitted uses. The third one is going to be development standards, and that'll be here in a couple of months. But in each of the cases, as you can see from the blue type, in each case we do a staff draft, we review it with staff to try to make sure we haven't made mistakes in understanding or just factual errors, and then a public draft. And we are now have delivered to the city the public draft of the second of the 3 modules, which is the one dealing with zone districts and permitted uses. And then, so we'll be back in a couple of months to do the 3rd module, and then we'll begin the process of putting them all together, discussing them as a whole, and moving towards the adoption of the development code. So Kristen, let's go to the next slide after this. So, well, let's just go through this. Put them all up there. Just so you can see, the green are administrative. And we've organized, if you look at the left-hand column, there are 6 chapters in the revised development code. Green are the chapters dealing with administration, general legal boilerplate, procedures and enforcement, and then definitions and rules of what different words mean. That's been delivered. The orange is today, permitted uses and zone districts. They're the 2 heart of the development code. And then finally, in a couple of months, form and development control. So that's just visually how this is coming in and where the second module fits into the whole piece. Let's talk about, we're going to divide this up a little bit, and I'm going to let Kristen talk about zone districts. And then I will talk about the permitted uses. But I wanted to give you a little background. Several years ago, when the city went through the RUDAT process, came up with a lot of recommendations which we are told there is general public support for. No one has told us to not implement the RUDAT. The way it was implemented through a series of districts, overlay districts and just general zone districts, especially in the downtown area of the city, was really complicated. And to be honest, as soon as we showed up and started doing this work, we were told that one of the priorities of the city was to simplify that system and to make it more understandable. It took us a long time to try to figure it out, and that is really what we're here to talk about today, is that we think we have figured out a much simpler way of achieving the character that you wanted in those areas that came out of the RUDAT process. One of the serious problems that Kristen and I found when we were trying to understand what you have today was that some of the new zone districts had been adopted. They don't say that they're overlay zone districts. They act as if they're base zone districts. But the base zone districts were never removed. So there was a lot of confusion as to which of these 2 sets of rules actually applies in this case. And frankly, also, that was one of the problems, was trying to figure out what the RUDAT was supposed to, which of these were kind of overlay character controls and which were base zoning controls, which is fairly important to get right in a code. So that was a fair amount. There was also a sense, and this is something that the committee might want to talk about, that the level of control, the level of design control that was put in those districts was very high, very detailed. One of the interesting things is that since they've been adopted, you've had very little development in downtown Lake Havasu City. So is that because the economy was in the tanks? Probably. Is it because the zoning is complicated? Probably bears a little bit of the responsibility for that. But I will, just by way of background, when we do this work around the country, it's very tempting when you write form-based controls for an area, and these were form-based controls that came out of the RUDAT. To what I would say, this is just me speaking personally, to go too far, to try to nail down the details of individual buildings and their design at a level that keeps developers away, because frankly, they're developers because they want to build what they want to build. They don't actually want you to design their buildings for them. And so I would say that, and this is just our professional opinion, there was some of that went along here. So as we've tried to simplify what is a base district, what's an overlay district, how do we communicate to the developers clearly what you want in this area? Can we make it simpler? Can we not make it quite so complicated or quite so detailed in the design controls that were out there? Now, that's our opinion. That's our proposal. We can explain to you as we get through here what we've carried over, what we haven't carried over. You can tell us whether we got that right or not. But that's the background. So, Kristen, do you want to walk through this? I'll run it if you want to talk through the zone district part of this.
So looking at the zoning districts, it's kind of like a big puzzle piece in how Don was saying the overlaps between your form-based districts and your existing special purpose districts made it an interesting puzzle to see how we could take it apart and put it back together. And so just generally our goals for this module, I mean, number one bullet point is looking how we can make everything simpler so that developers want to come and build. And actually make use of these districts that you guys have put a lot of time into crafting, and then retain and implement the RUDAT vision, which is definitely out there, but is just remaining dormant. And then always looking at how we can be consistent with state and federal laws, and that's going to come up more so in Don's discussion regarding uses within these districts, and improving the user friendliness of the code, and that comes out in the zoning districts, where here's just an example of an axonometric drawing that we've introduced for each zoning district, so that folks can actually envision what these dimensional standards associated with their property really mean. Next slide, please. and so then again, just talking also about the other component of this module is looking at the permitted uses, and Don's going to go into further depth about what uses are allowed within each of these new districts. We, like with the zone districts, uses have been consolidated, and broader categories have been created, so that there's more flexibility to do things without being too specific within each zoning district. And that's all presented in a table, which really helps for comparison purposes, as opposed to long lists and pyramid-based zoning that you guys currently have. Okay, so next slide. So this table should be somewhat familiar. We initially presented it, if you can think back to our detailed outline of your code and where we wanted to go in this process. And on the left side are your existing districts. And right now, your districts are broken down into residential districts, commercial and employment districts, special purpose districts, and overlay districts, which actually isn't too many categories. A lot of communities also, agriculture and public, you actually don't call out in your code, but that was just to kind of categorize here. But we are looking to break districts down into 3 categories: residential, mixed use, and special purpose, and then your overlays. And so, like I started to talk about, when we're looking at zoning districts, we consider, how can we consolidate to make this process simpler? Are there districts that are unused? And you guys do have a lot of districts, like we talked about, your newer form-based districts that are unused, but also not shown on here, but within your text, there still remains a hotel district, which is non-existent. There's some, even though you transition to the form-based districts, you still have a medical overlay that exists in your code, and so that kind of adds to the complexity of what are we really looking at here. And so overall, we're trying to bring like districts together and eliminate obsolete districts. And so right now there's 30 districts on the left-hand column that are existing, and we're looking to consolidate all of those districts into 24 districts. And the special purpose districts. So here, where Don has just circled, we're trying to show the transformation that was supposed to occur between your 1980 special purpose districts and your 2008 form-based districts. So there was at one point a McCulloch overlay district, and that exists in your table, but not in your text, but you do have a new form-based district. And we'll walk through the consolidation a little bit in a later slide with examples, but essentially, as I'm sure you're aware, the form-based districts are broken down into different transects. So there's three, they're all currently mixed-use transects, and it's your core, your center, your general, and then the edge. And the core, the center, and the general all allow for commercial, office, and residential. And so what we're proposing is that the three transects, and we're trying to stay away from that transect term, just call them sub-areas, and just fusing those together into one mixed-use district. And then the only difference would be that edge district, which is strictly residential according to how the RUDAP presents it. And that's a residential district that initially we were calling this commercial residential in the original version of this table, but we have since moved that residential only component up into the residential zoning district, because that's a high density residential district from what we understand you guys are looking for in that downtown, your main street of Lake Havasu.
So just a second, just to clarify. So if you look at the left-hand, the shaded yellow things, there are 4 ways you were trying to deal with the downtown in 1980. There were 4 that you came up with in 2008, but there are actually many more than 4, because on each of those lines, there were sub-areas. So there were more like 10 or 12. So you had 4, you turned them into 10 or 12, but the 10 or 12 didn't replace the first 4. They were still there. And so that was where we got very complicated.
And the only ones that wouldn't be downtown so it would be 3, because the commercial...
Southgate is different.
We had the commercial Riverwalk is in there as well.
But we wanted to point out that in trying to understand what has happened, MU, the districts that start with MU in the right-hand column are mixed use. The districts that start with C, your vision, your own RUDAT vision and plan says those are commercial districts. That means they're not supposed to have housing in them. They're just commercial. And then you had areas that were supposed to have only residential and no commercial. Those don't appear in the shaded areas anymore. They appear up above our Upper McCulloch and Health District and Southgate. We've moved them up because there's a whole category in Lake Havasu City, which is residential districts. And you called for some of the downtown areas to be plain old residential transition to the downtown. So just calling out, the arrows are supposed to kind of point out to say, the portion of the work you did back in 2008 that said, okay, these places, not along the corridors, but next to them, between them and the neighborhoods that are supposed to be residential, let's call them residential districts and just put them up into the menu of residential districts. So I hope that's helpful, but that's what we had was a lot of things going on, tripping over each other in the shaded yellow rows that have been pulled apart into, instead of 10 or 12, into 3 different districts, 4, MUMS, CCHD, MU, CRW, and then the commercial Southgate, and then move those up to the top. And the residentials are up there.
Yeah.
Don, a question. The Southgate district, isn't that commercial? Isn't?
It is.
But you've got it.
Well, there is a residential part of it too. There's commercial along the highway, and then you had residential areas north and south of it. So that part of it is its own residential.
And we are
district.
retaining so there's a C Southgate, and then there's the residential component.
Yeah.
Okay, I see that now, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and like Don was saying before, only you guys have taken that step of rezoning your commercial and health district, and that was the only one when you look at your code where all of what was, or when you look at your zoning map, where whatever was underlying is no longer. The overlay is not considered.
We
It's
did the core in the Main Street, didn't we?
As far as we can,
The core part of the Main Street?
no.
We didn't do the
you
other ones?
didn't.
It's
All we did at the time was we rezoned the CHD,
commercial
the
health.
commercial health district in its entirety, and we only rezoned the parcels along McCulloch Boulevard, which would be the core, yeah,
Okay.
to the UMS. The
Right.
rest of it is just on paper as
Right.
they were.
And even that UMS had sub areas in it that weren't actually rezoned.
exactly.
Okay,
So
and the reason they
general-
didn't rezone it is because it required a land use change.
Okay.
And that stopped a lot of that.
Okay. That's good to know. All right. Sorry to interrupt you, Kristen. Go ahead.
Oh no, that's helpful. Okay, I think I think walking through the next slides will explain everything more clearly. So in the residential zoning districts, we actually went from 9 districts. Usually we like fewer districts, but but we're staying consistent at 9 residential districts, and that is mainly because of the RUMS, the RCHD, and the RSGD moving up into that category. So there's not a ton of change within your residential zoning districts. The R1, which is most of the city, is remaining the same. And one thing I do want to just start off by saying, so our next module, form and development controls, will look at the dimensional standards associated with these. So although we have looked at them on a cursory level to make sure we're not making any consolidations that wouldn't make sense, but looking, if you think of the consolidation that we're proposing for R2 and R3, we can't say exactly yet what the lot square footage would be, but usually in these areas we remain conservative, so we would stick with whatever the R2 dimensional standards are leaning towards.
Do you want us to wait on questions till you're done, or do you want us to?
Probably be better, but if you got one, you need to.
Yeah, if you want.
I've got it noted, so we can go back to it.
Okay, well, why don't maybe at least done a slide and then and we can stay on residential before going to something else. So the main differences here that we're proposing are joining R2 and R3. And in creating a limited multiple family district, in R4 and R5 in creating a general multiple family district. In R4 and R5 in the existing code have identical purpose statements, and their dimensional standards are the same. And so we felt like that made some pretty good sense. And then we already talked through the creating the higher district residential districts from the special purpose areas. So if it's on a residential topic, maybe ask the question.
Okay, well, I was concerned, the R2 and R3 are way different in my opinion.
Okay.
Your densities are different, your land use currently is different.
In the code, the densities they both allow for 4 to 10
Well,
TUs per acre.
there was a discrepancy in that. In one area, the written said one thing, the chart said another, and when I brought it up at a commission hearing, R2 was said to be 2 to 4. R3 was 4 to 10, and if you look at the densities and the general land use, they're different. One is medium density, the other's low density. Plus, you have other regulations that say if you're near an R1 or an R2, then restrictions apply as far as you're limited to the base zoning heights. So if R2 is gone, that can change that area. And I know there's not a lot of R2 designations, but that still could affect. They're kind of smaller if you look at the big zoning map that the city has. And I thought it was up there. I guess it's not.
Let's, Stu,
I
can
almost brought
you-
mine.
Is that true that the R2 is supposed to be 2 to 4 DU to the acre? Do we know?
I can go check the table, but I think so. Do you want me to get a big zoning map or something?
Sure.
Well, it
Well-
changes your
Well, it
dwelling
cha-
Like
units
in
per
the-
acre, everything. I
Well,
mean,
it
the
changes
type
the
of
rationale
housing.
behind the again, when we read the code, it looked there was one land use change, and then the densities looked identical. If that's a misprint, if that's a misunderstanding, and it never was supposed to be the same, then that affects our thinking, so.
See, when I'm in the table, I read the table and the text to both be 4 to 10, and I think that was how we based our judgment.
So you had a verbal, though, at some meeting, Lori, that it was supposed to be
Oh,
too
I
far.
found, in my first few years on the commission, I found lots of issues with the table
Okay,
and brought those up. Unfortunately, when they did the reprint, they were going to correct them, but they didn't get corrected, so I believe
So,
they're still the same.
rather than coming back to this, let's talk about it a little bit. If, let's assume that, it is written so that they're the same, but the city did not, do you have any thoughts about whether the city wanted them to be different? If in fact, one is supposed to be 2 to 4 and the other is supposed to be 4 to 10, those are very different densities and characters. And it's not impossible to blend them, but our thinking would certainly change. Don?
Well, it seems to me something should be different. I know Stuart and I just had a conversation about a week ago with R3 lots, the density in R3 lots. That seems to be,
They said that it was,
in my opinion at least, quite high.
and if you look on the
And I'm not sure that
so
R2 and R3 should be combined in that respect, because
This,
Okay.
4 to 10.
So we have both you think it might be okay to keep R3, you're not saying the R3 is too high, but you certainly wouldn't want to have it blended in with the R2 lower
well, I
density
can
stuff.
look in that other one too.
Is that,
well, to answer your question, I wouldn't want to have them blended together necessarily, and I'm still not comfortable with R3 lots being as high as they are.
okay, so all right. We haven't done the densities on those two, but I'll take those two different comments. That's good.
Okay. Another question I have, in the event when you merge those,
Yeah.
do you automatically do a mass rezone then?
Usually
From
when-
from whatever zoning's going away to the new one?
Usually when you end up a process like this, at the end of this, anytime you rename zones, you need to adopt a new map. It is usually a citywide map. So it is a legislative rezoning to align the zone district labels with the current code. So far, none of the things we've done have suggested that we redraw those lines in different places. It is simply that two colors might become one, or things that were buried inside the UMS district where you had to read the text to kind of get the submaps and they weren't shown on the map, that those would be mapped actually to show where they were. So the answer to your question is, yeah, when you get to the end of the process, you need to have a map that reflects this new terminology, so you need to do it, and that's what would happen.
Okay, then do you notify the property owners? And they
Absolutely.
you have to go through that whole process?
Absolutely.
Okay, same with the land uses, if they're now changing, because a lot of them I noticed would be.
I don't know, are you talking about the plan? Plan land uses, or?
Yeah,
No.
well, in the general plan, they have the land uses, which a lot of those
Well,
have now
I
changed
can't,
too, so.
I can't speak for staff. That's a matter of Arizona law and what you want to do. Usually, there are processes you have to use for individual parcel by parcel rezonings, and there are processes you use when you adopt a new legislative code or a map for the whole city. At a minimum, they have to comply with the latter. Whether they decide to go further and say, we want to mail out individual notices or put them in utility bills so that every single property owner knows that, I can't speak for them. That'll be a city decision as to what
Okay,
they do.
what's the law on that, though? Can they actually do
The
a
law,
mass
law
land
on that
use
is that
change?
if you are doing a citywide rezone, I'm not an Arizona lawyer, so
Okay.
disclaimer. In most states, as I say, there are two things. There's quasi-judicial rezonings, where I am rezoning Don's property, and Don and his neighbors need a lot of notice so they can comment, because there's a risk that I'm singling him out.
Right.
And there's extra due process involved. If you have a city council or a planning board considering a new code for the entire city and a new map for the entire city, the sense that you're singling people out is a lot less. You're trying to adopt a new system for the good of the whole city. And the law usually there is that you do not need to mail individual notices to every property owner. That is, like every other city council action, like changing the parking regulations or changing something else, it is a citywide legislative policy. However, we've worked in cities where they say we want to do that, or we're going to pick out the ones that have significant changes and we're going to mail out notices to all of those. But usually it's not required by law, because the risk that you're picking on people or that you're
Okay, I got
doing an unfair thing is very low when it's a big, broad citywide discussion. So,
Okay, that makes sense.
want to go to the next slide?
Yes, please. So the next slide is
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, just in examples of the illustrations of your districts that they're going to be included in the code.
But I want to be clear as we go down. I've heard at least two. I didn't hear from you about it. That there's some doubt that 2 and 3 should be blended. That the intent, whether we read it right or not, there may have been an error historically in saying that those were more similar than they were, and that there's some uncomfortableness on this committee about doing that. So is that fair? Or am I?
Well, Don, I guess I wouldn't have as much of a problem with 1 and 2, being
2 and 3.
combined, or 2 and 3 rather.
If 3
But
wasn't so high.
If 3 wasn't so high,
Okay.
that's right.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, and I guess to me, I don't have a problem with them being combined either, and we'll get into the details of that later, I guess. But they're pretty similar in nature, and I think in
Okay.
2 and 3.
right now in terms of what the table says in the code, and I mean, you look around town at how it's been applied differently around town. So I think we can find a middle ground to tie the two together,
Okay.
because I would be up for that.
Okay. Well, then we have a continuing discussion on that topic to see what we can do with it. Let's go ahead with the commercial and mixed use.
Okay, we actually we talked through probably the bottom bullet of this more so. So another, it looks like a substantial change, but I don't think it will really be felt all that much, is the creation of this mixed use neighborhood district, MUN. And in that, as you can see, will combine existing CN, CO, CR, and CRMU. And our understanding from reading the code and talking with staff is that CN and CR were visions of McCulloch's to try to bring smaller scale, convenient, local businesses to residential areas. But that really hasn't materialized in the city either. And looking at your zoning map, there's very little, or CN and CR is non-existent. I think actually CO has been used more so to achieve that intent. And CRMU it only exists on the island, and that was a merging of mixed use with commercial residential, which in and of itself, I mean, even just the name implies a mixed use area combining commercial and residential. So it seemed completely reasonable to merge those 4 districts together and to create and to allow uses within that area that are going to help achieve McCulloch's vision, but to also craft use-specific standards that will preserve the neighborhood scale that you want that district to have for neighborhood protection reasons. And so that's the main difference within your commercial employment sectors. And then the next couple of slides we'll walk through an example like we talked about already of mixed use UMS and mixed use CRW. And mixed use, the commercial Riverwalk district, unlike your other special purpose or form-based district, didn't have any transect or sub-area designations. It was just one district that allowed both commercial and mixed use. So that was really easy to see how it could become a mixed use district in and of itself. Okay, so this is our mixed-use Uptown McCulloch example of the consolidations, kind of that you were talking about, Laura, that need to happen. Okay, Don, this shows the transects, and then if we click on through...
Can I have a question with the CMCR before you move forward? Do you want me to wait on those?
No, go.
Okay.
Go, sorry.
Okay, if you look at all of those, I completely disagree.
Okay.
See, when you look at CR, the title was very misleading, and you can talk to Larry Didion about that. They put the residential in there because they wanted lodging. It was not intended for residential uses. None of these are. They're supposed to all be commercial. So to turn those all into mixed-use districts, I mean, if you go on the zoning code currently and you read the explanation of what they are, I mean, CR, for example, says the district is to be applied to areas characteristic or appropriate for a variety of visitors serving retail services and lodging uses. Nowhere in there is it residential. And then when you go back to the charts, the only thing under residential is they have a caretaker unit. There are no other allowable uses under a residential component.
Well,
So I guess I'm wondering how this all got turned into, we're going to allow these zoning districts in our residential areas as a mixed use.
Well, let's back up and take them at it a couple of times. CN and CR do not exist.
Nobody's used them.
Right. So Can we agree that we can take them off the table? I mean, why would we preserve districts that have not been used in
That's fine.
decades? So we're talking about CO and, I'm sorry, CR is the one you want to talk about? And CRMU? Are those the ones you were just referring to?
The CO was considered more for office
Yeah,
uses.
right,
And to bring them closer to a residential area.
right.
Not necessarily make
Yep.
a mixed use with it.
So it's CO and CRMU are the two
Yeah.
that you think are.
Well, and then there's different heights with CR, so
yeah.
you've got to bring that factor into play. Mixed use in neighborhoods.
Yep.
So far, the community doesn't want that. I mean, they want certain commercial aspects, like on the Four Corners, you might have grocery store, gas stations, things like that, but they don't want.
Well, but these are CO, and let's take them one at a time. CO is generally a buffer district. It happens next to a residential district, and it allows office uses. Why? Because the office uses are pretty innocuous. They don't bother neighborhoods. But I'd make the same argument for residential, for attached residential. Many cities that are doing this are going in and asking themselves the question, why, if we are designating these as, now, a main street might be a main street, but if we're designating these for commercial, why wouldn't we allow residential at the same scale in there? Why are we keeping it out? And what I hear you saying is the neighbors don't want it. And my answer is, well, I'm a little surprised. If most COs are going away around the country, the idea of a commercial district that is limited to office uses, the only reason it was created was to buffer you from more intense commercial uses. But we also have multifamily attached townhouse districts and other things that buffer you between a commercial district and a residential district.
Well,
So the
they
question
do
is,
now.
why not allow them both?
I guess my question is, you have the buffering now, but once you throw mixed use in there, that buffer is going to slowly disappear.
But it is a buffer. It's the often. I guess I'm not understanding your question. The buffer is anything that is not intense commercial or low density residential. Anything between those is a transitional zone. Right now you have one that says only offices. And what we're proposing is one that says, no, you can do low intensity buffering or transitional stuff, including medium scale residential. And I'm not sure why you think the buffer is going away. The buffer, that's the same buffer. It's just got more uses than it had before.
Yeah, you're blending it a little bit more,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
in
yeah.
turn is increasing the buffer. It's providing more diversity into some of those areas, which I think is a good thing. I understand Laura's concerns. It's kind of against what has always been the case, but
Right.
I think if you look around the world today, you'll see, we haven't seen it in Havasu much yet, but we actually have some stuff pending that's been pending for a few years that starts to do this sort of thing, which started to introduce some of this mixed use stuff years ago. But I think going forward, you're going to see a lot more creativity from developers and builders trying to do that. And like Don said, why not put residential above a commercial use? You know, you don't have to live there if you don't want to, but it is a good live, work, mixed use application. And I think it does help blend some of these districts together. So
Okay.
Personally, there's some things to work through in terms of some of the development standards and how, ultimately what is allowed and what's not and what the setbacks are and heights and all of those things. We can get through that, but condensing it into more of a mixed use and pulling some of these things together, I think, is a good thing.
Okay, I think the reason you haven't seen a lot of that in Havasu is because it isn't allowed. And from the people I talk to now and in the past, they don't want Havasu to be like every other city. That's why our code did get so complicated and complex, as there was people on the other side of the issue going, no, we came here to retire. We don't want all this stuff brought up into our neighborhood. So I just want that looked at too, because they're supposed to have the protection of neighborhoods. And if you get rid of the R2, now some of the buffering that was required is gone, because now it's no longer R2, so those restrictions don't apply. So we need to look at it close.
Yeah, in my opinion,
Okay.
Havasu too it's almost about as mixed use of a town as you can get when you really step back and look at neighborhoods, whether it's, old houses next to new houses or commercial and industrial areas next to R1 neighborhoods. It's kind of mixed use and random in that way, and that's what people like. So I think there's a way to allow it and to help it rebuild and infill better than what has continued to happen over the years and still keep the character that is Havasu that people love about it.
Okay.
And I would agree that the buffer zone could be more commercial.
Okay.
Could be,
Could be more commercial, or it is commercial now, you mean, could
But
be
I mean,
more
yeah,
mixed use?
it could remain that way. I mean,
Okay, okay, so you would agree with Lori
Yeah.
that you'd like to see it stay the way, you kind of think it ought to stay the way it is now?
Yeah, that we could include some residential in it though.
Oh, okay, all right,
Yeah.
Okay.
By all means.
okay. Let's talk a little bit more. You had raised CRMU as being, your feeling was that shouldn't have been called residential, it really was lodging. It was supposed to be a lodging for the island, is that right?
If I remember back correctly, and staff can comment, it was to get like down by the village and around that area to allow the hotel uses and other type of lodging uses. It wasn't intended for a residential element.
Okay. Well, we'll have to think about that. You know, I got to tell you, I want to do something with it because just saying, well, we got CR, we got some MU, let's put them together and make CRMU, and let's apply it to a little bitty parcel. You know, that's I don't like that solution. It seems it is mixed. Well, your feeling would be it really wasn't supposed to be a mixed use. It was a lodging and commercial. Is that right? Not mixed use.
Correct.
Does the RUDAT say anything about that, or is this pre-RUDAT, or is this outside RUDAT? I think it's outside
This
RUDAT.
is outside of
Yeah,
Rudat,
okay.
yeah.
Do you guys have any thoughts on it? I'm just trying to figure out what, if we rethink it, how we scratch our heads, in which direction we scratch our heads.
Well, personally, I'll put it out there. In my opinion, I've never liked how that's come together to begin with. I mean,
Okay.
I understand the concerns of doing that, but to create a viable, in this case, our riverfront, our waterfront is a downtown. I mean, it's kind of the heart and soul of Lake Havasu, and the more people in an appropriate manner we can put living, working, playing in that environment
Okay.
is a good thing to the long-term sustainability, I feel, of this town. So to restrict it to just lodging, and what is lodging in this town? I mean, a lot of what was trying to be prohibited, the condos and the townhomes and things that could be part of a district like that, really are lodging in this town. They're in most cases they're seasonal use, 3-month, 6-month type uses that switch over. So how do you differentiate a timeshare unit at a hotel that could be lived in for a week or lived in for 3 months to a condo that could be rented out for 3 months or 6 months?
Which is almost
So
impossible to enforce.
the use
It's
is
very
almost
hard,
the same. It's just
Yeah.
what terminology we're putting on it. Because I think a lot of that sort of development, you wouldn't see full-time residents living down there. You'd have a few, but a lot of it would be wintertime visitors and summertime
You think it's going to be,
visitors
it's
using
condos
those.
that are probably going to be managed for tourist occupancy, at least part of the
In
year?
most cases, I would guess a large percentage would be that sort of tourism-based, rental-based
Okay.
residential use.
Go ahead, Stu.
There is only currently one property in the city that zones CRMU, and it's on the center of the island.
It's on the island.
It was the original McCulloch Corporation. Now it's called Grand Island Estates. It was villages on the island. And really what it did is it incorporated a residential subdivision and also allowed a hotel and commercial uses as well. And at the time, we didn't have a zoning district that incorporated all those things. The district was created, used this one time, and never used again.
Well, maybe the answer to that is that in the citywide rezoning, we rezone the residential part to an appropriate residential district and the commercial part to an appropriate commercial district, and just get rid of CRMU and say it's not zoned mixed use general or mixed use neighborhood. Because if it's a subdivision next to a commercial or lodging development, then we got other tools to deal with that. Is that I mean, I see a little bit of nodding. This sounds like a mapping. It was a convenient way to solve a mapping problem, but it shouldn't live on just because of that.
Yeah, I think that would be a good approach in that case, because if it was true mixed use, the hotel and commercial uses would have been a little more integrated
That's right.
into the residential uses. And in this case, especially today now, they've been split up and subdivided completely as separate projects. So that would make a lot
It
of
really,
sense.
yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay. Good comment, Laura. Do you want to go through the example you were going to, Kristen?
Yes. So once again, what we're looking at here is the Uptown McCulloch Main Street form-based district, and if you click through, Don. So this first oval indicates the core, the center, and the general subzones. So the core, like Laura had pointed out, is the only area that has been currently rezoned to UMS. And so, but all of these 3 sub areas do currently allow for mixed use, but it's not clear from the existing zoning map. And then the next edge subzone is strictly indicated for residential development in the existing code, and so that is remaining RUMS.
Let me, if I can weigh in on this, I just want the group to focus on this. This is part of what we're trying to simplify and say, look, what's the fundamental use? And the red ones were intended to be residential. The others were intended to be mixed use. But I will state that even though I like the diagram very much, it's a pretty diagram of the future. I think this is overregulation. I think this is parcel by parcel designation of strips where, at least my experience with the world is, it doesn't turn out in this neat a pattern. And you would have a healthy upper McCullough and get reinvestment if we just said, look, things that happen between a block and a half of McCullough, we don't have to micromanage them to the degree they're being micromanaged here, and it would allow more people to have flexibility, and all of which are going to put shoppers and people living and working near McCullough, which is what you were trying to do. So I'm just saying that when I made my comment earlier, I didn't see a lot of nodding, but this is not the first time when we've written a code for a mixed-use downtown where we've been stared at a diagram like this and said, is it likely people will come through parcel by parcel and agree to build in this very detailed pattern? And the short answer is probably not. They're probably not. And so that's one of the reasons why we think some of this can be generalized. So, okay.
But the area you have circled in blue, does it include inside of Mesquite and Swanson or outside also?
Yes, it includes the outsides because you can see that they crossed the city on the bottom side. They crossed. It's the hatching. The ovals are intended to match the hatching patterns.
Okay, all right.
So it's the hatching pattern on the outside of Swanson there.
Okay, so the outside of those two streets are actually the edge instead of the core.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can see it. Yeah, just pay attention to the hatching more than the
So we have mixed
ovals.
use inside the blue area.
Yes.
Correct.
Well, yeah, right. Well, you already do.
Yeah.
You just don't have it as micro divided in terms of its specific character. That's fine. And uses.
Yeah, a perfect example, Don, I think of what you're getting at is with the addition of ASU to
Right.
downtown.
Right.
That kind of blurs the line in terms of, I mean, that wasn't in the picture during the RUDAT
Yeah,
timeframe. So
right.
I think if they would see that today and that study was done, you'd see a different set of connectivity put together to incorporate ASU into Main Street.
And this is probably a good. Can we raise the ASU issue now and talk through it? ASU expressed some opinions earlier in the process that we be respectful of the kind of diverse mixed-use neighborhood they want to have, and connections to downtown that they would like to have the students have. And I think it'd be beneficial for the school and be beneficial for downtown. It's usually, especially when the school is of the size that one is right now, it's a win-win. You want that connection made. So we scratched our heads a little bit about whether we should create a new ASU district or a new overlay district, and concluded in the end, we don't really think so. We think what probably ought to happen when you get to the end of this process and you have to adopt a new citywide zoning map is probably to stretch the MU-UMS out to include that the connections to the campus. Because when you ask yourself, what do they want to help the campus be vibrant? The list and the character that you come up with reads a lot like mixed-use UMS. And so rather than create a new district, that's not on the slide, it's not something, but I wanted to let you know, ASU's expressed some concerns. We've thought about it. Why isn't there an overlay? We think there's a more elegant way to achieve that intended character. So,
Yeah, I would agree with you. And so in essence, what you're proposing here is that the whole core, and we can define what that core is, it probably includes ASU, is the MUUMS, and then the edge is really your buffer. It's still mixed use, but it's buffer. So
well, the mixed use in this case is residential.
Yeah.
just residential.
Just residential
Okay,
in this
yeah.
case. Yeah.
And provides a buffer from the neighborhoods around it.
Yeah,
Okay.
which is what the RUDAT called for, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
The only difference from this diagram that you're looking at now is that this diagram is conceptual and it doesn't show a potential remapping to get in ASU. But that, because we're not talking about the map today, but we're talking about districts, that's why there is no separate district for that purpose in our proposal.
But I would agree with you that the ASU should be included
Okay.
in the
Okay.
UMS.
Okay. Laura, you look troubled.
Well, when this district was designed, and if you look at the PD sub-districts, they were specific to lots, and that this type of zoning could only be used in this specific geographical area, much like an overlay, which I believed you had to have it as an overlay, but it wasn't till years later that I was told, yeah, it should have been an overlay or for the intent, because you don't want this type of zoning used over on the other end of town, like on Sweetwater or whatever. You want it specific to this area. Now, if we start removing all of the lots, we start removing the geographical area, then if you have that land use, you can ask for that particular zoning in any of the areas of the city that the land use is the same.
You've said that a couple times, and I'm not quite sure I agree. If the intent of the district states, look at these are named mixed use Upper McCullough Street. If they're named and the intent makes clear that this is to be used there, I don't think there's much risk of it being used somewhere else. But the bottom line is, city council can apply any zone it wants anywhere in the city, no matter whether it's called a particular name or not. So I guess my point is that the risk that city council would use districts in a way that was not intended is there no matter which topic,
Yeah,
no matter how you go about it.
You haven't dealt with what I have through all the years, and yes, it happens, and if you know the general plan, you can twist it to fit whatever your argument is in most cases, at least the way ours was written in the past. And staff can present it in such a manner that I can tell you the majority of the council isn't into the zoning. Yeah. They don't understand 100% of what the zoning really entails, such as the districts. I mean, they're relying on staff, I guess, to give them just simplistic answers, because zoning is really complex.
Yeah.
So,
but let me
I do have a problem, because the way it looks like it's being done in the general plan and the zoning, in the future, it's going to be justified that this is what everybody wants. If you read the general plan, everybody's looking for a mixed use element throughout our city.
But if I look, let's separate two different issues. You mentioned PD, the 10 different types of PD. We're not talking about the PDs here. So we will talk about plan development, and we have removed that. But this is not PD. This is a map of particular blocks colored in particular shades of.
Okay, but it was considered in the PD district
It
if they
was
wanted
one
additional
district, yeah.
height, and all of the properties that were applicable to that and that could ask for the additional height were listed.
I understand.
That's all going away, so that removes the
But on a
protections.
Tuesday night in March, I could go into city council and say, please amend the text of that PD district, and then zone me into another, and then zone me into it. I mean, there is no way of drafting a zoning ordinance so that council can't amend the text and put you in a district that they want to put you in. So, I mean, if we want to go there, the PD, yeah, I'm sure you disagree with what we've done with that too.
Oh, I do.
I've never, but we've never seen a city that did that. I've done 40 cities, and the firm's done 130. I've never seen a city that had 10 flavors of PD criteria locked into particular blocks of the city. So you obviously feel it's necessary. Do I? Well, if it was necessary, I think I would have seen it before now. So I don't think it is, but it seemed like an attempt to really try to box people into some very narrowly constrained boxes. And I can tell you feel strongly about it. I just have to say from a national perspective, we see it very rarely, and I don't advise you to go down that road. So, but I hear your deep concern.
Yeah.
You don't
well,
like
it
it.
actually opened the door from what our code was prior to adding the districts. It actually,
Really?
yes.
It opened the door to some outcomes that you didn't like or didn't like or did like.
Some of the stuff I do. I mean, in some areas, yeah, I really like the mixed use element, and it helps to develop our city and to get the developers in. But in other areas, I don't think there should be an option to do it.
Okay.
So,
Are we
And
ready?
just to be clear, this is listed under the special purpose zoning districts, right? So there's a number of caveats there that say
Yep.
this is here because of Main Street, because of Upper McCullough.
And the purpose statement specifically says this is to help you achieve your Main Street vision for this area.
Okay. No, these are not supposed to be generic. None of these are supposed to be generic, especially the special purpose districts. All right, let's keep on going in the interest of getting through.
And then this slide just adds another snapshot of your current zoning in that area. to show that it's an existing conglomeration of C1, C2, and actually I think here there are some examples of CR and CO mixed in. And so and so this colorful palette, aside from the beige and the orange, which indicates the residential that flanks the mixed use area, will essentially be consolidated into the MU UMS, like we discussed. So it's just a process of aligning the text with your transect areas and the underlying zoning through that broad rezoning process.
And
that John
the
discussed
UMS
before.
and the UMS, just, again, it's not supposed to be generic. What we've done in the UMS district is try to carry forward those character controls that we thought were not generic to the city, not just good landscaping or good lighting, but things that came out of the RUDAT about the intended character of the core of this central area, broadly defined around Upper McCullough. So I guess I want to be clear. Not only does the purpose statement say that, but we have not carried over all of the details of the current form-based design standards, but we have tried to carry forward those that we thought were fundamental to achieving that goal. So it's not sitting there and throwing away the RUDAT. It's carrying forward the parts that we thought were essential to getting that character. So
I have one more quick question.
Sure.
That's the landscaping, parking, that type of stuff, correct?
yeah.
Okay, the parking, and this was an issue that myself and other commission members had.
Yep.
When they started designing this, it was intended for block-by-block development, and they were going to have big parking garages.
Yeah.
So a lot of your details within this zoning,
Yep.
the parking
that.
elements pretty much, it gets really strange with the
Yep.
parking structures because you can't tell somebody on your property all you can build is a parking structure or a parking structure. But that is what this code does. So have you fixed all of those issues with that?
No.
Okay.
No. But what we're parking, I'm glad you raised it, Lori. We've carried forward, I think what we did, Kristen, we carried forward the parts we thought were essential, and we footnoted them and said, look, Module 3 is where we deal with parking. And frankly, the common parking plans, parking and common plans, is a tough thing that Kristen and I have yet to kind of unravel that skein of yarn and figure out what we can do with it. But I'm glad for your comment, because I'm not surprised at what you just said. And it's not the first time we've run into this. The assumption that if you just draft the right form, essentially these guys will sell out to each other and somebody will assemble the block. It doesn't happen that way. Development never happens that way. And so, well, rarely happens that way. So our assumption going forward is we want to get the character we want, but assuming that somebody's going to build big parking garages is Fort Worth in 1960. That doesn't work that way. It has to work as parcels are redeveloped individually, and each one needs to find a way to park or to have access to parking. And that's the approach we'll take, but we have not figured it out yet. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to it. We will not assume that there are going to be big parking garages on each one, because I do not think there's anybody who's going to do that. So, okay.
And just for a more concrete example, within the MU UMS district, like one standard that we carried forward are siting and element standards for McCulloch Boulevard and also for Mesquite and Swanson. So siting, for example, 65% of the front building line of each primary building must be located on the property line. So some of those design elements that you had articulated in the RUDAT have been carried forward for this district. Okay. So special purpose districts, we've talked through a handful of these. Essentially how we think of special purpose districts, not only as special development areas, but generally as anything that's non-residential. And so we have grouped commercial, business park, industrial, conservation, preservation, and your public zoning district into this category, this very broad category. And so C1 and C2 are remaining intact. Those are our traditional districts that you see in most places around the country. A main change is going to occur in the division between your two industrial districts. For a community that doesn't have much industrial development to begin with, we found it interesting that you do have this M1P, which essentially is a campus-like industrial setting. And so to encourage the economic development that you guys want to see and to bring in more of the business professionals that we heard you want to attract and those themes that are that are brought out, that are confirmed in your general plan, we are proposing that the M1P become a business park district, and then that just leaves one industrial district that accommodates light and any heavy industrial that you do foresee. And then another big change or consolidation. Again, it looks big on the screen, but I think in practice, like the effects of it may not be felt for a while. Is a consolidation of your agricultural district, your current conservation preservation district, which hasn't been used, Body Beach, and the Island District. So this is a consolidation of an existing base district A1 that does appear in the text on the zoning map, CP, which is in the text but hasn't been used. The active and passive resident recreational, I think, uses that you foresaw for that area really haven't come to fruition, as well as the Body Beach and the I districts, which are a result or were a result of the RUDAT. And so
And they weren't never mapped, were they? I mean, they're drawn in the code, but
correct. BB and I were
there
not
is no
mapped.
there is no BB on the zoning map,
No.
and there is no I on the zoning. They're just areas
Correct.
described in the RUDAT. So
Yeah. And so if you go on to the next slide, Don. So basically, our thought process with this district is that all of the land that binds your city, and most of it, which is under the jurisdiction of the state or federal government, to actually encourage them to bring the uses that you would like to see in these areas. Let's get rid of the four. Let's not make them have to look at 4 different districts and determine which standards apply to which areas, but just give them one consolidated set of standards but that do deviate. We are still calling out specific requirements for Body Beach and Island when they're relevant. I'm trying to think of a good example. I think, in terms of a hotel, on the Island District, or a conference center had to be associated with a hotel. Even though that's allowed in this area, on the island, it needs to be associated with the hotel. It can't be a standalone conference facility. And a couple of big changes or a couple changes.
Well, just let me jump in here a minute, just so people understand.
Sure.
If you look around the borders of the city, 95% of it is not the island or Body Beach. It's mostly ag land, and it's unused land. So 95% of this is a carryover with a new name of what is A1. Then there are parts of this that are, by the text of the zoning, only applicable to the island or to a defined Body Beach area. Yes, this is a use in the CP. Can I do it north of the city? No, it's only allowed on the island, or it's only allowed in the Body Beach area. But it solves the problem that your controls on BB and I are not mapped anywhere. They're not on the ground today. They're just in the RUDAT, in the text. And the fact that we can probably simplify the whole thing rather than creating additional specialized districts just for those 2 areas and say, look, it's publicly owned land. It's almost all state or federal owned. Yes, we want to do things. Yes, we can limit the things that are active water recreation or active resort type things to the places where you want it to happen without having to create a separate zone district for it. So that's the general thinking. Go ahead.
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
What would be the purpose of putting light agriculture into the conservation preservation district? My concern with that being most of that, I believe, in town is the state land that surrounds the town or the unzoned exterior parcels. And that's the only land available in the future for this town to grow. So putting that into a conservation district is going to limit, well, I mean, sure, anything can be rezoned, but once you label it conservation preservation, I think you're restricting growth and causing problems in the future.
Correct me, Stu, if we had this discussion with staff, and I think staff was nervous about our designation of CP. Remember, A1 is A1. It's being renamed. It's not being restricted beyond what it is now. We thought that if I look around the edges of Lake Havasu, there's not a lot of agriculture going on. So we said it's conservation preservation because it's really a land holding zone. But it's not more restrictive than the A1. All the A1 uses are allowed in CP. we could, if you want us to, we could take it back and say, Don, you're going to confuse people too badly and they're going to think it's restricted. Just call it A1. So I want to be clear, by putting the 2 in 1, we have not restricted the uses beyond what you would get in A1 now. But the name we thought was more accurate, but you're not the first person to be concerned about the implications of it. So
Yeah, I think that leads to problems down the road when you've got
Okay,
state
all right.
land that's public use land right now.
you'd
that
feel more comfortable.
I know will, some pieces, some did come to the table in the past.
Okay.
Never got developed because of the economy, but you're going to see state land anyway look to be developed someday. And when that comes forward and the public thinks it's conservation and preservation land,
It's going to be,
it's
been
going to
hard
be
to
a problem.
explain that was
I
the
would
intent.
think, I don't know, I can't speak for the state, but I would think the state trust, which uses those lands and eventually sells them for education, would have a problem with lumping them into conservation preservation.
And we expressed the same concern. We had the discussion with Don, and basically what it boils down to is conservation preservation to Lake Havasu City, as defined, means something totally different than conservation preservation on the state land level. And you're right. But my comment to Don was, let's go with it for now. Leave the name on it. They're part of this review program. We send them not only the general plan, but also the zoning code changes, and let them object to it if they have a concern. It really consolidates or incorporates all of the elements of the conservation preservation, the Body Beach area, the island area, which all take into consideration all the setbacks with regard to the shoreline protection. I mean, those are all together. And the A1 agricultural district, as it was originally created, was just really a placeholder for that, to allow the least amount of development on it, assuming that it would be rezoned at some point in time. I mean, we could call it something different. We could call it agriculture or whatever, and then maybe ask the state what their preference is, considering that 90% of that land is probably federally held or state held. And if they have concern with that conservation preservation tag on it, maybe we just ask them what would you call it?
Sure. I understand where you got to that, and obviously that's not for me to decide. But I just feel in this town where we're restricted already in our development potential,
Right.
we are. And I know Laura isn't with me on this, but it's when you set that, I just think.
Right, we understand.
Council, you can probably jump
you've
in
raised
on that, and it would be a hard sell.
You've raised two issues.
I would
5
agree.
years from now, when somebody is trying to develop something that's labeled as conservation preservation.
All right, we hear you.
I find it funny. You can understand it when it's CP and prohibited, that people can look at that and justify. It was intended to be a conservation district. That same feeling, flip it to mixed use in areas where mixed use wasn't intended. What do you think that same argument, except this argument's going to be, well, the intention was to have mixed use here because look, it's all named that. Same argument you're having, flip it. So I don't have a problem with you changing it because I agree what he's saying could very well happen.
Yeah.
Just as it could under the mixed use and all the ones I have brought up.
Yeah.
The justification is, look at how it spelled it out. The intent was to have mixed use in these areas, when in reality, no, it wasn't. So I find it kind of comical because on the one end you can see it, but the other end you couldn't.
Okay. Should we move on? Kristen?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. And then the final category of overlay districts. Very little change here currently, but we do have a question to pose for you all. So an airport overlay district, very typical. It's an area that dances to its own tune, and so it does need specific standards for that area, and so that is being carried forward, as is the North Kiowa Commercial Overlay District. Initially, we had proposed just carrying that forward, but when we looked at it a little bit more closely, we're posing the question of whether it could go away altogether, and I'll get into that a little bit further in a second. And then currently, Laura, like we were talking about briefly, you have a PD process which is grouped as a land use permitting process, and it lists all your, I believe there's 10 sub-districts, which most of these mixed use areas now have assumed the place of these sub-districts, allowing for the elimination of them. But so we have transferred that land use permitting process into an overlay district zone, so that it functions more like it was intended to as an overlay.
Okay, want to go to the next one?
Yeah, and so in terms of the North Kiowa Commercial District, underlying North Kiowa, it's basically C1, but it functions, like the slide says, as more of a C1, C2 hybrid from what we can tell, that it was created to be a little bit more permissive than C1. I think you brought in some light warehouse uses and allow outdoor storage, and the intent was to bring additional architectural design standards to that area, probably I think requiring stucco and just different building form standards. But our proposal would be that how we're structuring the code now, that you could zone it simply as C1, and any of those existing standards could become use-specific standards that apply to that C1 area. Allowing for the elimination of this overlay district. And so I guess we're curious from you all whether that seems doable, if this district works as it was intended to.
So just to be clear, the draft that we have delivered to the city keeps it. But every 2 days, Kristen walks into my office and said, Don, why are we keeping this? What purpose does it serve that is worth it? So it's just to be clear, it's our question to you. Do you want to keep it? Is it important? Is it being used? We can think of simpler ways to achieve the same result, but we don't know what your thoughts are. That's all.
I guess I'd ask, have you driven in that area?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we
'cause
drove it during our
that one's
tour.
real different. And I think that's why when we were even creating some of this stuff for the sub-district, you look around and, I mean, the way the setback is, all the parking's in the front, I mean, it had some weird quirks to it. So if you just rezone it as a C1 or C2, I don't know that you're going to
So
hold
you're
those specifications, or if you want to hold them. I mean, I think it
Well, that
looks
was my
for that
question.
area, it looks pretty good, but I don't know that it's necessary either. So I guess I'm kind of up to see what you come up with as an alternative.
Well, Lori, your comment suggests that it was unusual, and the intent was to preserve that unusual character, that it was important, at least at that time. Okay, yeah.
And that's what I was going to ask. If you did look to change it, where were you guys going to go with that? Or just remove it altogether and...
Well, I think the thing that we have batted around is this. It is C1 plus a couple of uses, which we could allow. We could say, look, they're allowed in C1, but only in the Kiowa overlay area. We can define those things. Well, Lori, the question is, the more base districts you have, and I would extend it to the more transects within base districts you have, and the more flavors of PUD you have. At one level, it sounds easier to just create a rifle shot district for every little piece that you have a different vision for. It gums up your code unbelievably down the road. So when we say it'd be better to have, if it's so like C1 that you could tweak C1 and make it just applicable here, it's not just semantics. It actually simplifies the operation of the code over time, because more multiplied zone districts create ripple effects to the whole code. So the short answer is, we could say C1, I'm just talking out loud, includes the two uses that you wanted that weren't allowed in C1. C1 henceforth allows light warehousing, and it allows whatever the other, outdoor storage. Only under the following conditions. A, it's located within X feet of North Kiowa between X and Y, and B, it's screened. So you could do that. But the second part of the question is, are there character areas? Lori mentioned the setbacks. And our question to you is, does it matter? What if somebody came into that area, bought a property, and decided to put their building up near the road and they're parking behind the street? Do you care? If you care, we keep it, because then you're trying to preserve the character, and presumably the property owners in that area want to preserve that area. If no one cares, then you get rid of it, because the truth is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how they would redevelop those things.
I think I care then, because if you had, and this is one of the issues I had with the Main Street too.
Okay.
If one lot can have it one way and then the next lot's different, it starts looking really hokey as you drive down
Okay.
the street. Now,
All right.
maybe in a bigger city,
Okay.
you don't notice it as much.
Okay.
But here, when you drive up those roads, if you had a bunch of them up 5 feet from, or, from
Mm-hmm.
the highway, whereas the rest of them are all set back 20 feet, it starts looking weird. And the first thing you say is, "Guy, this one's right up here, and yet all the other ones are." I mean, it looks like a sore thumb.
Well,
I
it's just,
think.
you've gone down that road, and we're happy to keep it. As I
Yeah.
say, it's in the draft today.
The other question I do have, uniformity clause, how can you say C1, which is used everywhere, you use it only a certain way here?
It
What if the
happens-
guy over here
if
says,
we
well, I
didn't-
want to do that?
If we didn't do that, Lori, every code would have an enormous number of zone districts.
Okay, so
And
you can do it and it's
Yes,
not a
you
legal
can.
issue.
You can. What? Yeah, I read these things. I'm a land use lawyer. It's been decades since I've seen a uniformity clause on zoning where the court invalidated zoning because it wasn't uniform. The short answer is a zoning district needs to treat all similar properties, all similar types of property the same way. When you draft in there and say these particular rules are only applicable to the lots along North Kiowa or into this defined area, and you have said in the code, and you are treating everybody within that area according to the uniform rules, you're probably going to be upheld by the courts. Was it the way they intended zoning to be used? No.
Right.
Is it overturned? No, because I think the judges look over and say, if I overturn this, all that does is every corner of everything they want to treat differently, they have to create a separate zone district for it.
Okay.
That's not a good way to run a city,
Okay,
so
that
I'm not
makes
going to make them
sense.
do it.
Okay.
So,
Okay, thanks.
all right, shall we go? Let's go on to permitted uses.
And
You
this will
can-
explain better how you could link standards to specific areas.
This is good questions, good discussion, and we're almost near the end of the presentation. We can just throw it open at that point. Kristen mentioned that the second part of this Article 3 is to consolidate all these uses into a table here. You can see in the chart in front of you the categories that Kristen mentioned. Residential, mixed use, and special purpose are the three colors at the top of the columns. The top row tells you the new name. The row below tells you the proposed districts that are being consolidated into those areas. Left-hand column is where we group them by type. We're just showing you a sample, a part of it that has the industrial uses, and then in lighter purple, commercial services, it kind of groups. And this just helps you down the road, because instead of just adopting lists in a new zone or modifying it, you look at the section of the table that is like the thing you're thinking about adding and say, well, do we need to add it, or is it already covered? Or could we just redefine an existing use so that it includes or excludes that? So basically, in every table, this shows industrial. So of course, most of the districts are blank because you can't do industrial uses in residential areas or in mixed-use areas. And over at the right-hand column, in the special purpose districts, there are either P's for permitted or C's for conditional or A for accessory uses. In the far right-hand column are use-specific standards. And this is almost all new codes are written this way so that, for example, outdoor storage is the first white line after the purple on this table. If you read across, there are some zone districts where you could do it as an accessory, meaning you can't just buy a lot and store stuff outside, but if you have a business, you can store stuff outside in relation to that business. Then you have, it's allowed as C and some P and others. And then you have a cross-reference, 14303D1. Right after this table are all of those standards that apply to a particular use. And that is where you can say, if this use is, for example, let's just make one up, and I'm making this up. If this mixed use, if this multifamily use is located within 200 feet or 100 feet or adjacent to a single family zone, its height has got to be no more than 35 feet. So you come up with that use, which can be geographical, the discussion we just had, or adjacency based, or whatever you need to do to carry it on. And that way, in the future, if you come up and somebody needs to do outdoor storage in a new district and you want to consider it, fine, but fine, but it's going to have a lot more screening than we have in the existing districts. You go down to that section of the use-specific standard and say, fine, in this new district, we now allow it, but it's going to have a lot more screening than the other. And we're going to define how much it is. So here's here's an example Kristen's put up of what those things are. We've gone to a different part of the table, dwelling single-family attached. This is just an example. It cross-references you down, and then she has put down these we've brought in from other parts of the code the different things that applied. And this is one way we tried to simplify the downtown districts was to say, look, let's just bring all the conditions that applied to a particular use into one place. So here I'm not going to read them to you, but this is just an example how immediately following the table, you would look up, is this the one that deals with dwelling single family? Is it the one that deals with dwelling single family attached, meaning a townhome? Let's go to the next slide. Go ahead.
Oh, no,
Okay.
that's fine. I was just going to say, I thought that those use-specific standards kind of did play into the clarification of these uses. So just
Okay, go back.
if we wanted to. Oops.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry about that.
Here you go. That's it, 21. Okay. Well, is there something you wanted to highlight to them? I thought I could just read it.
Oh no! I just wanted to call out the fact that if there was something specific to the CP district, we could call it out in here like we did.
Yeah.
Something specific to group homes and fair housing that are included in the definition of single family housing. We can call it out in here, and that was basically just the point there.
Okay. We have tried to clarify and align your group living law with the law of the state of Arizona and the law of the United States. This is usually a very unpopular topic because people don't like to have to think about this, but you have a set of overlapping definitions of different types of group living facilities now, and we've tried to straighten them out. And so boarding and rooming houses are no longer in the code. We have tried to define a small group home under Arizona law. That's the same as a single family dwelling, and you need to treat it that way. So we have tried to be very clear that that's it. State law says if you've got group living for less than 6 persons, it needs to be treated as a single family. It just is a house. Anywhere where you would allow a single family house, that's right. But it's limited to 6 people.
And they can be unrelated then.
Yes. The state, that's why I say it's an unpopular topic. Even in cities where you limit the number of unrelated people, the Federal Fair Housing Act basically says there are classes of protected people. Yours right now doesn't align with that, and this is a change. We are recommending that you align it with the federal definition of who's protected, and that's you can't discriminate based on age, race, sex, familial status, or handicap. And the real thing to focus on is a group. Right now, under Arizona law, you have to treat it as, under Arizona's definition, as a single-family house. But the ones that actually worry people are, under the federal definition, a group home for recovering drug or alcohol users is protected. I don't think it is under Arizona law right now. Is it? It is not.
I don't believe so.
And I'm not pointing at Arizona. It's not under Colorado law either. It's not under most of the 50 states' laws. The problem is you could be aligning with Arizona law, but you still could get sued for violating federal law because those people have a federal right to live in a single-family house. And so the two that annoy people, used to be HIV/AIDS recovering, but we don't see very many facilities for those patients now. It is recovering. Now, if you're addicted to drugs and alcohol and you're not in a program, you're not protected. A lodge for people who are drunks and need a place to live is not, and I didn't mean to offend anybody, if you're using drugs and not in a program, you don't have a right here. If you're in a recovery program under federal law, they need to allow you to live as if you're living in a single-family home. So we are recommending that Lake Havasu City, and we make this recommendation to all our clients, that you come into a compliance with federal law so you don't get sued for violating that. But you would not be the first city to say we're very uncomfortable with that.
So we have to stay with the 6-person limit then?
Yeah.
To make that
Yep.
work? Can we go beyond that under any circumstances?
Can you go, you mean to 8 or something
Yeah.
like that? Oh, of course. The state law just says that you need to treat it. If they don't have, the state says, and federal courts are torn. Some courts say 6, some say 8. But the courts say that If you are only no more than 6 people are living in here, it's no more than a family with 4 kids. And,
So
and
the-
you probably got those somewhere. So, yeah, there you go.
This can be in any of our districts. then.
Any districts where a single-family home is
Right,
allowed.
okay.
Yeah, so. Large, and then we have said, look, we're just trying to make it simple. The state law says 6, so let's say 6, below. Above, we just call that now a large group home. A residential care facilities. A large is a residential care facility. I just want you to be aware of this, because it will come up when this comes forward for hearing. You don't, to be honest, have to do it. We've had clients say, well, we'll just wait for someone to sue us under the Federal Fair Housing Act, because it's so unpopular. We don't advise that. The day that they do sue you under the Federal Fair Housing Act, you'll wish you hadn't done it. But this is some of it a change. Don, were you suggesting, you could say 8 if you wanted to. It's just that the state law says 6.
I'm not so concerned about the number being over 6, but where are we with some of the, I guess they'd be more commercial districts?
Well,
Can we do anything there?
well, residential care facilities are allowed. The larger ones are allowed in those districts. Can you allow the small ones in those districts? Is that right? Is that what
Well,
you're saying?
right now, we can't use, as an example, off Sweetwater, Southgate. I guess it would be Southgate overlay right now. That area doesn't qualify for this type of use.
Okay.
Group homes.
Because they are too big, or?
Well,
you know
I'm not sure, Stu, didn't we have a conversation on that at one point, a couple of years back? The old, Desert Academy on Sweetwater, aren't they looking at that at one point to be a group home, and what was the zoning problem there? They can't sleep
Desert
overnight,
Academy is a school, right?
but they can't sleep overnight in those districts, right?
Right. There, and I don't remember specifically what the concern was at that time, but there was no residential element in that commercial. Yeah, and we tried to address that when we did the new Southgate districts, but I think the committee suggested at that time that it was not, that they didn't want to integrate residential into that portion. They wanted to keep if I remember right, they wanted to keep the Sweetwater Maricopa corridor as commercial only, and then the outlying or the secondary parcels residential only, high density residential only.
That's how I remember it, and we were both on that committee.
Okay, well, I don't want to belabor this too much, but one of the reasons why we have gone down this reason, which I know you don't agree with, Lori, of allowing residential in the commercial area, in most commercial areas, to the degree you have a market demand for it, it's going to go in one of 2 places. It's either going to go near your commercial corridors, which is where we think is a preferable, or it's going to look and try to get land rezoned from single family to multifamily in your neighborhoods. And usually that's more controversial. So providing a place for the market to do this where it doesn't require quote unquote erosion of the single family residential corners and neighborhoods, that's one of the reasons we allow it. It allows a multifamily developer or a townhouse guy to come in and say, where will this be most painless? Well, I could go in here and not seek a rezoning, or I could go try to get the corner of 4th and Main rezoned. And so we kind of view it as, not only is it probably a good land use, but the alternative is, if there's market demand, they're going to try to do it somewhere. So where is the most painless way for them to, a painless place for them to do it? So, okay, go ahead, Larry.
I just have one question. The mixed-use designation in most of these, no single-family housing is allowed, correct?
Most of them, yes, that's right.
Oh, is there some of them?
No, I think, are there any mixed use where they're single?
I don't,
Chris and I,
there might be in the Main Street or the,
you have some where
No, the
the
one on the
current
other side.
code allows, we did allow, yes, there are some that allow it because,
there was, okay, so I
No,
guess my,
single family attached, but not
yeah,
detached.
not detached, single family attached,
I guess the
townhomes.
question would be
And we
in
were
those,
allowing it, but Luke found it.
Yeah, that's right.
in those specific mixed-use areas, then you could theoretically put 6 and under, correct?
A single family house
Because-
or a group home with 6 or fewer.
In that
under.
mixed-use area,
Yes,
which I don't
that's-
think was the intent in a lot of the areas.
No, I think that's right. But before I shoot my
Okay,
mouth off,
I thought it was more medium to high density residential was the intent of the mixed use. So we might want to clear that up.
Well, let's try to clear it up now. Kristen's right. No, Kristen's right. Stu and his staff caught us on the fact that we had carried over stuff in the current code said they were allowed. Single family were allowed in some of those areas.
I couldn't remember.
We took them out at their request. We took them out because it seemed inappropriate. So yes, in the current code, you could do a small group home in some of those areas because single family homes are allowed. Under the proposal, you couldn't. Not because group homes are bad, but because single family homes don't belong in those areas. Those are supposed to be transitional density areas. And
So the only place that we have currently designated or allowed them is in the mixed use, the neighborhood district.
the small mixed-use neighborhood,
Correct.
okay. And do we?
Meaning group homes now?
Well, we're talking single-family homes,
Oh,
but
okay.
anytime you talk
Single-family.
about single-family homes, you're also allowing small group homes. Do you remember why we kept it in there, Kristen? I'm sorry, I don't remember the thinking that you and I went through.
Just because it's more of a low to medium density
It's a
area
smaller scale.
allowing
It's not supposed to be
small
yeah,
scale.
the mixed-use neighborhood, once again, I understand the concerns that were raised earlier. It's supposed to be a small-scale neighborhood-friendly thing. And so the idea was it's not intended to be a densifying area, so maybe single-family homes would be okay there.
I still, just for being on the record, the mixed use in neighborhoods was something that we were assured by council back when they created all these districts would not happen.
Okay.
So I'm that is a concern if you start calling it mixed use neighborhood, then, oh yeah, we wanted mixed use in our neighborhoods, R1, R2, R3, R4, RA, RE.
Okay.
So, and they're not supposed to be.
Okay. Well, okay. Well, I mean, that's what this exercise is about. Your comment is, this is a change of.
Oh, large change.
Yeah, but a new general plan is a change, and a new zoning is a change. It's a change that you think you were assured was not going to be recommended or not going to be implemented. Okay, so that's.
So the only real place for group homes then is in single-family residential.
The small ones where single-family homes are
So
allowed.
we basically are not allowing anything
Well,
larger in any other
let me,
district.
back, back
Your
up.
multiple family.
Back up.
Oh,
Here, let's look at this. The larger ones are go under this.
which one?
No, go. You were on the right page. You were on the right. Go down. 22. There you go. If you can, yeah. Okay. Look at the bottom line. This is more than 6, Don. So, the more than 6 are allowed in the more intense, the areas that are closer to your commercial corridors, and we did allow them as conditional, meaning they couldn't do. But if somebody came in and said, "I want 8. I need 8," you could consider it as a conditional use. If you want us to take that out, we can. But usually you want a way so that if somebody comes in and wants a couple more, if they came in and said, "I want 15," you'd say, "I don't think so. That doesn't make sense."
Sorry, that's more in keeping with the requests that we get, because of we had a major code rewrite in 2004 that somewhat addressed this issue. However, it made it more confusing on one hand because it kind of combined the two definitions of group home and residential care facility, and they referenced each other, which was tough in and of itself. But needless to say, the one thing we have going for us is that about 80% of the lots in town are zoned R1 currently, and the majority of the houses on those lots are not large enough traditionally to accommodate any more than 8 individuals, give or take. Most of them will accommodate 5 or 6. So a lot of the requests we received early on were for 5. And then some would come back 3, 4, 5 years later and say, okay, I want 8 because I can, given the state parameters for square footage per person, they can meet that in some of the larger homes. But there are a large number of homes out there currently that you probably couldn't physically fit 8 in.
Okay.
So it kind of fits right along with what we're doing. The small ones allowed in the single family area, the larger ones in the multifamily area.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, the reason that my research showed, the reason for the residential care homes, state law required that we have that, and then when it got put in, that's where the confusion ended up being. I do have a question, the daycare, 10 or fewer, and adult daycare type facility, I think those were required by the state, if I remember correctly, and you have to allow them in certain areas. So
And we have, I think.
Okay,
We
are
have
they,
a lot-
those
but
aren't
we
thrown
wrote- I
under
think-
residential care, they're still.
No,
down
that's
as-
different. That's,
Consolidated the adult child care.
but adult and child care is different. These are different
Okay,
uses.
but these are day uses,
That's
correct?
right, that's
Okay.
right. Those are places where you stay during the day for care.
Okay.
You don't live there. Residential care does not include daycare, so. But we did combine adult and child daycare
As
uses.
the same, okay.
And we do think that's the right thing to do. And we aligned the number with the state, I think, didn't we? The state defines, I think
Yeah.
you said 10 or less.
Yeah.
But the state actually cuts it off at 7 or less.
Oh, really?
And so we changed it to align with the state number to simplify things, so, anyway, go ahead, yeah, Mike.
So when we're talking about this chart in the residential care facility, that encompasses both small group homes and large
No,
group homes?
this is the larger ones. But I haven't
So
shown
where
you
is
the
the
line.
small one, or you're not
The-
putting it in the code?
The small one is a single-family house, so you'd have to look at the line of the code that says
Okay.
single-family house, and it would show Ps.
So we don't even need a conditional
You
use
don't
permit,
need a
nothing,
conditional
right?
permit, no. And we strongly advise you not to require a conditional
Right,
use permit
right.
for that. It's just, it's,
And I guess that would be the question then, the other question I had was, in terms of state law and federal law, when you're talking about the larger one, the over 6,
yeah.
how does the law read into that? I mean, is allowing it in all districts under conditional use permit the right thing? Or should we be making a call as to those larger ones just flat out aren't allowed in, RE, R1?
Oh, yeah, I don't like the season.
Yeah. You know what I mean there?
That's fine. So if you want to, well.
I mean, I know the
again,
concern over, it just seems to me like, okay,
I think it's
I don't know
safer-
what the law allows us to do or not.
You could, well, let's take two different things. Larger ones, you have a lot more freedom, because it's up to you to decide where facilities of that size fit into the character. So if you wanted to take the Cs out of some of these R districts, you could. I don't think you'd be in any trouble with the federal government. However, the federal law requires that you provide quote unquote reasonable accommodation, which means the day an attorney comes in and says, I'm requesting 8, even though your thing says 6, you don't have to have in your code how you're going to handle that, but you have to give them a reasonable answer. And if it's not a conditional use permit, then you need to figure out how else you're going to do it. Are you going to let the city manager call them as he sees them? What are you going to do? Conditional use kind of splits that baby. We're not saying absolutely not. We are saying if you come in and you need 8, Stu's circumstance, we have a way. It's called a conditional use permit. You go through this process in lieu of creating a separate process. But some cities do create a separate process for that, yeah.
Yeah, and see, I think part of, if you look back at a couple of things we've gone through recently, part of that happened during the downturn of the economy, and all of a sudden someone's able to buy a big house
Yep.
in a RE, R1 neighborhood, and it can accommodate more
Yep.
than 6. So by having it in there as a conditional use, why not? Why can't I have, the house accommodates it, the neighborhood,
Yeah.
you could argue whether it accommodates it or not. To me, I think we could argue we have reasonable accommodation in R2, R3, higher density districts. There's enough lots, there's enough property, there's enough options out there.
And I think
for
if you
those.
decided to do that, you'd probably be okay. You would not be legally in a difficult situation.
Because I just think we're opening ourselves up to, wow, that's a great deal on a house. So we're going to be right back to where we were. Well, why won't you give me 8 or 10 in this huge house at the end of the street?
Well, you're still going to have to consider it. The fact that you say it's not allowed, and you could walk in and say, but I have this, we were willed a house by an old lady, and we're coming in with her, you're still going to have to give them a reasonable answer.
Sure, but I can tell you from my perspective on the development side, if I see a C in there,
Yeah,
my hope
no,
for
I
being
do,
able to
it's
do
fine.
it
Okay.
is a lot higher than if it wasn't
Okay.
there.
Okay. That's fine.
Well, and I think there's 2 keys. One is the reasonableness of it. And you also have to remember that the specific instance that you're talking about, the original request was for 20. So you could almost make the argument that 20 in a single family residential area, not to mention a affluent single family residential area, it carries a greater impact than the norm.
That would be easy.
Correct.
But I hear I see some nodding. I think you're all in agreement. What I'm hearing is you would like us to take the Cs out of RA, RE, and R1. Is that right?
That would be my preference.
I see Lori nodding. Don does too. Okay, great.
Because you're right, they always can come in and appeal to council and ask for something outside of.
Well, what I would recommend though for this is, The question is, how are you going to handle the rest of them? Because you have to have a process for answering it anyway. Even, I'm not trying to undo what you just recommended we do. The question is, if somebody does walk in with an RE property and ask for that, how are you going to handle it? It's not a conditional use. My recommendation would be that we come up with a system where administratively you authorize, I'm serious, you authorize the city manager or somebody to do the minimum required to comply with the Fair Housing Act, so that you come up with a way so that you have to have some way to deal with it. You don't have to put it in your code, but you should know what's going to happen. If you just say no, because it's not in the code, that is not reasonable accommodation. That's just stonewalling. So how are you going to deal with those things?
Yeah, we came up with that. I mean, you guys had council approve. If a reasonable accommodations request is asked for, then it goes to a hearing officer, which is hired, not a local person or
Yeah.
local staff. It was
Did we keep that?
outside entity. So that was just approved last year.
Yeah, did we keep that, Kristen? Do you remember in Module 1? I can't remember.
No,
Let's look at it. I won't belabor this anymore. We probably did. I think you did do that, and we kept it, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if you kept it or not, but I remember we had the conversation with Kelly, and
Yeah.
that's why I looked over my shoulder and she went to another meeting because she'll want to weigh in on that.
Okay,
Sure.
okay, all right. So let's talk to Kelly and see what we can do on that one. Let's not take any more time on it. Let's go ahead and get to the end of this. We've taken a lot of time. No, so we can, I'm afraid that I know you've got pages and pages of things.
You're lucky I couldn't get through the whole.
Kristen, next slide.
Oh, sorry, I'm looking at residential.
All right. These, I'm not going to go through these. I'm going to mention that in each of these cases, all of which are LULUs, locally unwanted land uses, where people are worried about them, we've tried to align them with state and federal law. I'm not going to go through them other than just to show you that they're there on the site, and we can discuss them any more in detail if you'd like. The intent was to align with language and with changes in these laws at the state and the federal level. Go ahead. Here are some new uses that we have used. You guys, VRBO is in there. We put it in because it keeps coming up as a question. I will tell, and they have use-specific standards behind them. Continuing care retirement community is just an area that allows everything from independent living to congregate living to medical care within a single campus. It's just something that's coming up as all of us get older, and it's been added in here. You can see that there, C's in there. Community gardens is another one. Vacation rental, guys, we have done what we have recommended, and this is simply a recommendation because we didn't give us guidance. He said, what do we do about this? And we said, it's extremely hard to enforce. Most cities that don't want to spend a lot of money enforcing it are saying, look, it's a business. If you want to do this, you need to register with the city, you need to pay fees, and we're going to impose some taxes on you. We're going to impose some fees for the extra burden of maintaining and watching them. But we are not going to prohibit them because we think it just drives them underground. So we'd be happy to do what you want to do. I think the key issue here is how are you going to enforce whatever it is you want to do?
That's exactly the question. We debated that already at a couple of different meetings, and how do you enforce this?
Yeah. Well, you enforce, all zoning's enforced by complaint, but I think cities have had, well, no, if someone turns you in and it's clear that there have been lawsuits over the fact that planners, Stu and his sit there and go on VRBO sites and search for Lake Havasu City, and you can find exactly who's offering houses for sale. It's not hard to do at all. The VRBO sued a city that did that on the basis that it was impermissible use of their information, and they lost. The judge said, you just told the whole world these houses were available. Why did the planners have to not know that? So they lost the suit. So the short answer is, if you want to enforce it, you can do it that way, but it just results in a phone call to the guy that says, you got a choice. You can come down and sign up and pay the fees and be licensed. Now we know that you do this. We got some extra excise fees. Or you can be ticketed for a zoning violation. Your choice. Which do you want to do? But that's how you have to enforce it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I got another one on this one. Basically, I was told when we don't have them, they still had the option then to enforce if there was a complaint, if you're not allowing them. Because then it can be, well, you're doing these as vacation rentals, but it's not in our code, it's not allowed.
Yeah, that's true.
So it gave you some. The issue we have is we are a visitor destination. And what you see happen is a lot of your bigger homes become party homes.
Yeah, right.
And so the guy that built this nice home,
Right.
now every weekend or during spring breaks, he's got just parties going on right and left. And how do you control that if you allow the rentals? I think we need to allow them because we are a destination. We are, but how do you control the other aspect of it, I guess?
You mean the trash and the noise and the stuff like?
Yeah.
You admit that it's going to happen, and I mean, I think we've found some cities that when you sign up for your license, you have to. They either limit the total number of people you can have occupying at any one time, and then if you got 15 cars in the driveway, you know he's got more than 6 people using the house, and you ding him for that. But all of this is just enforcement. They comment on your first one. What if we didn't even have a line in here? We could take the line out. We would have to have something in the code. You'd have to have a prohibition on short-term rentals, or it isn't a zoning violation. I mean, Denver has nothing. I can rent my house to anybody I feel like, any weekend I feel like it. Until you say that the ownership of a house doesn't include the right to rent it on a short-term basis. The cities that do it define it at 30 days. They kind of say, if you want to rent it for a month or 2 months, we're not so worried about partying, people are living here. If you want to rent it for less than 30 days, you go get a permit, and we can limit the number of people. But then again, it's all a matter of who will call in. There are cities that are charging fees. They've adopted a fee schedule, and the idea is we're going to get more complaints about trash. We're going to get more complaints about noise. We're going to get more complaints late at night and lights. And we're going to have to send the police out more often. And that costs money. And here's how much you're going to pay for the privilege of having one of these permits. So
Yeah, I just think everybody needs to kind of look at that one.
that's fine. Okay. Yeah, look at the use specifics. Look at the use. Once again, there is, we get asked almost all the time what the emerging practice is. And it's so new that very few people are doing it other than pure resort communities. I mean, Aspen and Vail have been doing this for a long time because they're mostly tourists. They've been doing this for a long time, but usually the approaches that the pure tourist communities do are not appropriate for a community that has both long-term citizens and tourists coming. So, yeah.
And if it's a permitted use or requires a business license, I would assume you could attach some rules and regulations then to that. So
That's right.
if there are complaints, at some point you would have leverage as a city to remove their license, and I don't know
That's
what other.
exactly what the use specific standard says.
That's
Yeah.
what this. When you go over to the right side,
So
and,
if it's
States
done
and
right,
license.
it could potentially give the city the right to go in and enforce and remove their right to do that if they
And
weren't
it's-
complying.
and it's easier because think about it. Anytime the real problems are with behavior, you're almost better doing it as a license. That way you jerk their license and you just say, you've proven that you're an unreliable party rental person. Now it is just illegal because you don't have a license. Every single time we get it, you're going to get a zoning violation for this. It's not an illegal land use, it's a house. So it's the fact that you don't know how to manage your house that results in you pulling your license. And that's what the use specific standards say. Let's go ahead. So, yeah, I agree with Lori. Look, it's right when you guys think it's right.
And can you only rent it to 6 or fewer people?
I think you could easily put limits on it. I'm not a city council person, but that's one of the first things I would do is to say, it's a single family. It's hard to enforce. I know it's their big homes, but
you're having, you could have 20, 30 people.
Yeah, and that's some of the complaints we get is from some of the bigger homes.
I
that
know.
have got a
I
ton
know.
of people.
That's why
every
they
weekend.
rented a big home so they could have a
That's
big
right.
party. Yep.
We have a few in our area, but you don't know somewhere else.
All right. Last couple slides, just wanted to point out that at the end of this table, we have separate categories for accessory and temporary uses. Just because the current lists made it unclear. Some of them were not listed as accessory, but you read them and they're clearly intended to be accessory. Or they're intended to be temporary, but they weren't. So this only point of this slide is there is a portion of the table where these things list stuff that is not allowed anywhere as a use by right, only as an accessory use. If it's something up above, if something in the first part of the table, maybe it's conditional use in this zone district, it's a permitted use in that zone district, and it's accessory in another one. All that stuff is found at the top of the table. The bottom of the table only lists things that can only be done as an accessory use in the following districts. So that's the idea. Go ahead. Kristen, I think we're done. Oh, maybe, yeah, that's fine. You had a lot of kind of rifle shot accessory uses that we've tried to put into a category and list them, but put them into that category. Go ahead. And that's it. We can talk, let's back up and back up one, Kristen. Oh, well, somehow we're not getting the back. No, that one there. This is just so we can wind up the presentation part of it. I mentioned that in a couple of months we'll be back with form and development controls. Lots of good discussion, I'm sure, about height and density and whether, if ever, you should be able to get more than that. And we wanted to remind whoever's watching or listening that the general plan update is nearing completion too. We're done. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I would ask that we get more time, because the way that this was done, I mean, you got all the footnotes, but you're going back and forth to different areas of the code. I never got through it all. I mean, there's 275 pages. We had 8 or 9 days. I didn't start it. I lost like 3 days. But sitting down, I want to see exactly what the changes were. And normally you can go through and it's redlined. Okay, we took this out, or this was moved from section. But to have to go down to the footnotes and figure all of it out for somebody that's really trying to see the changes is really difficult. Same with the general plan. That was difficult also because, I mean, you have all the footnotes, which is good, but actually going through it,
Takes time.
this was a huge module.
I know.
And I really look at it. I don't just skim
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
which towards the end of it, yeah, I skimmed through a whole bunch of it. But I plan on going back. So, RA, you included
Go back.
2 dwelling units per acre.
2 dwelling units per
Yes,
acre.
and it's supposed to be 1.
On
And
per
it
lot?
is supposed
Per
to be
lot or
rural,
per
yes,
acre?
because it's supposed to be rural residential.
Well, let's go back to that. Well, we don't have a slide on RA. So your point in the purpose statement? Is this in the purpose? Because we don't have the dimensionals in here, so it's in the purpose statement.
Yeah, I guess.
1
It's
to
in there.
acre in R1?
It's limited to
R-
1 to you, and you
in-
guys have 2.
In RA?
Mhm.
Okay. That, I
So
don't
that
think
would
that,
increase density.
okay.
There was a big talk about not having duplexes be cited as duplexes, but now call them
Well, they're I think 2-family dwellings.
two-family dwelling,
Two-family
and that
dwellings.
was now then going to be allowed in the
Okay, so that's,
RA. So
well,
that's a no.
oh,
You're only
wait,
supposed
is
to
it the
have single.
density? Is it the density or is it the type of dwelling? It's the
Both.
2-family dwelling.
It is both.
Both, okay, all right.
And
Good
that-
point.
And
No,
that
no.
was carried forward from what was existing in the code. If there were any density indications, they weren't changed. They were what was existing.
Okay, if you look at the charts in the code, it says 1 for RA. So I'm not sure where 2 came from.
Okay. We'll check it out.
And also, some of your state lands that you hold, I think they had the RA designation, which also limits it to 1.
Okay.
So if you change it to 2 and also to 2-family dwellings, which isn't, I mean, the homes that are built in the RA, you have horses, you have
Yeah, right.
agricultural things, keeping of animals. You don't really want, duplexes. I'm not even sure they'd pay that
No, I understand.
price
I understand.
for land to build a duplex anyway.
No, I think, well, we'll check. Your point is that it should be 1
Right.
and it should be single only. Single detached only. That's what your
Right,
comment
you can
is.
have a guest home.
Yeah,
But that's different than,
that's different than
Yes.
a duplex.
okay, because otherwise it will definitely change.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Okay.
Got your comment.
RE, I question the community gardens. Currently, they're not allowed. The new code, they will be allowed. I don't know if that's something they want in the RE.
Well,
Do you live in the RE?
we can do whatever you want.
You
Most
can.
communities are just allowing them in every residential district.
It's kind of a
community
new fad.
What's
It's kind
a
of
new
a new
fad?
thing. It's a good thing, I think.
I don't know.
I don't think it's harmful to put it in there as part of the RE district. Whether it'll happen here, I don't know. We'll see a whole lot of community gardens in this town just because of
I
our
don't think
climate.
so.
But
Yeah, I know.
Um,
We thought about that too.
it's a, I don't,
From a water use standpoint, that probably is good not to have.
Probably wouldn't be sustainable.
The other
Yeah.
side of that.
yeah. So
Okay.
it's good to me either way.
It doesn't matter either way. Okay. And then the RMH, I'm
Mm-hmm.
kind of confused on that. Are we saying that all those types of housing that we're bringing up are you only use in a park setting? Did I
No.
interpret that wrong?
There
No,
is
that was
a use
confusing.
of, there is a residential mobile manufactured,
Correct.
residential manufactured home park district. That's
Right.
for parks. You can have a residential mobile home outside of a park.
Okay, that's where I got confused.
Yeah, and it's subject to the same kind of quality, skirting, utility, location standards that you would have in a park for that individual home. You don't have to lay it out as a park, but you still have to have the quality standards you'd have to do on an individual home.
So you're saying that can be outside of a park?
how do we treat the individual, is a manufactured home outside of a park is defined how? As part of a single-family dwelling, if it meets the standards? Yeah, and is that state law, or is that not state law? No, okay,
Well, and there is a big difference between a manufactured home and a mobile home.
that's
Yeah,
right.
there you
One
go.
meets
Yes,
HUD
right.
codes
No,
and
no,
one doesn't.
manufactured
so-
home meets HUD code.
Right.
That we've
The
clarified.
mobile home is not allowed.
Mobile homes are
Mobile
not allowed.
homes should
Mobile
not be
homes are not
allowed.
allowed.
A manufactured home that meets HUD code should be
Right.
allowed if it's put together.
That's
Per
that's
city
the
and-
approach that's in the code now.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't remember seeing where we address that in the code.
Well, it's in the
but maybe
definition, I
Of
think.
so it's in the definition of single-family homes.
Okay,
So
I'll
where
look- yeah, I didn't
single-family
get that
homes
far.
are allowed.
Well, but I think it's also in the use-specific standards for, no, it's in the, no, that's right. It's in the definition of single-family home, and it says, if this happens to be a manufactured home, it's gonna have to meet the HUD standards. So you can't, there's no such thing as a mobile home that doesn't meet HUD standards sneaking in to a residential neighborhood.
Exactly.
So,
Okay. The Channel District, there's notations in the footnotes, I think it's number 97, that takes out the limit on residential units and says the market forces will drive that.
Yep,
That was another condition that was put on that area because most of the developers that were coming forward basically wanted to turn what was commercial only into, what is it, 80% you could have that were, I forget the percentage now off the top of my head. But you could have, the residential component could be up to 80, okay. So we were afraid that that was gonna turn into a residential, and if they are year-round, they now are gonna have a huge group that's gonna come forward whenever you try to do anything in the channel. What rights is that gonna give them? So
but how are
By
you gonna
t-
enforce that number?
the limit, well, before, if you wanted the additions in height and other things, you had to go through the PD.
No,
which
but if you didn't
therefore
want the
controlled.
additions in the height. My memory is that there was a number in there.
There
more
is
than X-
300 and something.
Okay, and I took 300 of them. Now, how many do you
Yes.
get?
Well, it's about already maxed out. So yeah,
Is
if
that
they
the
come,
intention?
if they come after the fact, sorry, the residential component for this district has
Okay.
already been,
And that's a problem, though. I mean, I said it before and I'll say it again. I think to restrict it like that is not in the best interest of the city. You've got a project right now that's entitled for a whole bunch of units that probably will never be built. So you're restricting future growth over somebody just because they obtained entitlements. And besides all of that, I just think it's not in the best interest of the district to do that. To keep common commercial space, public space on the ground floor, I fully agree with. But if you're allowing 60, 90 feet of height to stack units on top of that, I think is the right thing to do.
Yes, and when that district was created, they talked about exactly what Laura brought up. They were concerned about the potential of the residential density.
Yeah.
And at the last minute, somebody said, well, what if we get two big projects, and that's exactly what happened, that claim all those units under entitlements, then what do we do with the rest of the district? And somebody said, okay, well, let's just put a cap on it. And so we grabbed whatever that number was, 336 or whatever it is. And now we have two projects that have almost all those units except for 9, I think. So looking back at it now, there's probably, I mean, it should be determined at some point in the future based on a project, whether or not it fits within the scape of that area.
well, I think the issue at the time too, though, was you're taking an area, pretty big area, which all of our visitors, we wanted to draw to this area. That's where they go in the boats. You didn't want it to turn into all residential. You wanted that commercial element. Well, from my perspective, 20% is only required to be commercial. That's too low. And then it showed you the first two
But
developments took.
as a practical matter, though, isn't it going to be ground floor? How many commercial uses are you actually going to get that go above the second floor? So as a
Well,
practical, so if it's 6
Do they need
floors,
hotels considered commercial use? I personally would prefer to see hotels there. It's where the people can stay instead of condos and all of that stuff. And granted, like you said, you can have people that stay there weeks or two, but having them actually own it outright gives them additional rights regarding the area. And you saw that with the RV park. I thought that was the wrong place to put it. Gorgeous development. My question at the time they got that rezone was the one out by the airport, are you going to sell them? Well, we could. Well, once you sell it and then something comes in after the fact, it's, oh, we don't like this, we don't want this. Well, they built in an industrial area. We're going to put in industrial use, but the voice was fairly loud. You guys had a problem at your council meetings. I don't want to see our commercial visitor designated area turned into a residential because they can make more money per unit by selling it for $1 million, I think is what they were going to try to do. So I think that area needs to be protected for commercial.
Why do you think it hasn't developed with commercial already?
Because most of the developers that came in
Oh,
wanted
because-
the additional height. And at that point in time, the whole community was against the added height. And they wanted the residential component because they can pre-sell those, and that's where they get their capital to build
I
it.
understand, but my point is that there may not be that much commercial potential down there without the residential mixed in with
It's
it.
got to be market driven, and I think the underlying code will restrict. It's not going to it's never going to turn into a whole string of high-rise buildings. I mean, it just, with some of the restrictions that are there between a certain amount of commercial space, parking, and some of the things that I think are vital to maintain the public's use of that space and the right mix use of that space, you're never, there's restrictions in place that are going to help control that long term.
No, they're taking all of those out. The parking are going to become citywide parking standards. They're not going to be specific to the district, from my understanding of what you said
Well-
you're doing. So all of those things we put in there to ensure you didn't have it are now citywide parking standards.
Well, we have punted on whether we need to carry over specific parking standards because we haven't thought through the parking stuff till Module 3.
But again, now we're talking specific uses within these districts. I guess that's what we're talking about in residential units too. But the parking stuff, I know the concern. I mean, in a case like this, I would think in parking, we have an extra component here.
Yep.
We have a public use parking requirement. So even though the parking may be generalized, there more than likely will be an additional regulation that is
For this
controls that
types of
area that
use.
provides X number of parking spaces to the public for public use. So I think there's a way through that.
Yeah.
I think just we've got to be careful to not over-regulate it because otherwise nothing will ever happen there. And that's the direction it's headed right now.
Okay, and I agree. You want something built. You don't want to open the door so that just anything is built and then it messes up with our tourism up.
Okay.
One of the things, even with all the residential that I forget what the name of the project was, but where the English Village is, they couldn't get it to pencil out. The parking structure alone and the amount of money they were intending to get fell through. So they don't want the underground parking, which they have to have due to the exceeded height that they were able to get.
Well,
So I guess I will have to
projects that
see.
can't pencil out because you're trying to get too much on there.
Exactly.
And hence the point of not, then if someone else comes in and wants to build a project with 40 units and they can't do it because we've restricted it
Yeah.
to a guy that has 300 units who
Yep.
financially can't make it happen, now you are holding the city back because of that.
I guess my point is if you figured in the whole entire area, here's the residential component you wanted for that area, then you divvy that up some type of a percentage. If you have this much commercial, we're going to give you X amount residential. Because the commercial component is so important down there, and I hate that we're looking like, well, it's okay, they're not going to build commercial because it's more profitable to build all residential.
Yeah, and I understand that concern. We do have to maintain a sense of commercial and a sense of public use along that channel. But it's a mix. Again, it goes back. If you just look at like the London Bridge Resort, for example, it is not a true hotel. It is a timeshare property, so it has individual ownership component to it. So there's a fine line there. There's a mix there that I think can be achieved. Some may be full individual ownership where people are living in them full time, but a bulk of them, I truly feel, no matter how that gets developed, are going to be secondary home, some sort of timeshare, some sort of multi-use that's going to support tourism. I mean, the bottom line, I'm with you 100%. This town, our industry is tourism. It always has been, it always will be. And I think we can find the right balance there
Yeah.
to facilitate public use, but also allow one of the driving factors in our town for tourism, which is secondary ownership or secondary use of homes and condos and townhomes and hotels.
Not having enough
Okay.
of that.
About that, yeah, that's right.
Why don't we do this just in terms of time? We can stay long. We have another meeting in 55 minutes, but we can stay longer. But in terms of time to read this, Laura, we are, the sooner we can get comments, the better. But the door is never closed. We like comments sooner rather than later because we're working on Module 3. We got to crank that through. There isn't a date after which comments won't be taken. We will take them. It's just that the sooner we get them, the sooner we can roll them into our thinking and try to make those changes or at least acknowledge or have a discussion with staff as to, look, this seems to make sense. What do you want us to do about it? So, but there isn't a cutoff for comments on this. And you have so many, though. If you'd like to respond, if you'd like to put them in writing, we'd be happy to respond in writing and copy the committee so that everybody knows what the responses were that we gave to your questions.
Okay, my last question then deals with the zoning administrator. I had brought that up at the previous meeting that we had months ago, that some of those duties of zoning administrator and director got mixed. So you guys were going to clear that up. But I also brought up the concern that because we're a smaller city, the staff member that does the zoning administrator duties also holds the meetings and also is the staff member that the Board of Adjustment can contact if they have questions, because the Board of Adjustment is quasi-legal and they're limited on who they can talk to.
Right?
So the public comes in, they ask for an interpretation from the zoning administrator, which used to be in our code, the director's duties. They get their interpretation and they don't like it. Prior to, if the director made the interpretation, they could appeal it to the commission. They didn't like commission answers, they went to the council. Hey, this is what I thought I could do with this section of the code, and now the guy's telling me, no, I can't. And he had that appeal process. If the zoning administrator makes that decision, it goes to the Board of Adjustment, and that's the only place it can go. And if they agree with staff, then their only option left is to go to court or convince the council to change the ordinance if they know somebody on the council. I think from the public perspective, if the person telling you, well, I interpret it this way, and then you say, okay, then who do I go to get a different interpretation? The Board of Adjustment. Okay,
Oh,
I'll
wait.
go to the Board of Adjustment, and all of a sudden you show up at the meeting, oh, the guy that made the interpretation's holding the meeting for the Board of Adjustment, and he's the one recommending that they agree with him. That, to me, is just opening the door for...
That is the 95% of all the places in the country do it that way because, I would say the opposite. The way you said it, I want a different interpretation. No. The zoning administrator interprets the code. If he or she makes a mistake, you appeal it. You ask the question, did he make a mistake? Not, I don't like your answer. Okay. And once you get an answer, he didn't make a mistake, that is the end of the process. Now you need to go to court and say, my own city is breaking the law. It's very rare to take an appeal to the city council. To be honest, with all due respect, I have great respect for city councils. Deciding whether the zoning administrator made a mistake in reading a code that he reads every day, that council doesn't read every day, you've just turned an administrative technical question into a political question. And that is not a good practice. Yet now it's all a matter of does the council like me or do they like the room people that are... I'm not trying to offend anybody, but most places say that's why you separate it. There's a guy who reads the code for a living. When he's decided, you have one route to say, did he get it wrong? And then you say... I think my own city is breaking its own law. I'm going to ask a judge.
Okay, I get that, and I guess I'll use two examples then with my concern. We had one where it's a similar use, okay? And the similar use was for trampolines. This one, I don't know why the zoning administrator didn't get to make that decision, but the director said, I want it to go to the commission because the review of it, I'm assuming, is what they did. The zoning administrator said he did not feel it was a similar use. Now, normally, if it's a zoning administrator that made that decision, they'd have to go to the Board of Adjustment. Yeah. Because the director had the ability to say, no, you know what, this decision of interpretation, I want the commission to read it and decide on it. That was...
I understand.
Okay, but if under your scenario, all decisions are made by the zoning administrator, that couldn't happen.
I understand.
So I don't like that. I don't think one person should have the ability to interpret a code that the commission discussed and came up with the wording, and the council approved all of that wording in text, and yet somebody that never was with the city could come in, take over the position of zoning administrator, and they perceive the intent 100% opposite of what the intent really was.
Well,
Whereas you're,
The question of zoning code is not to go back and revisit the past and figure out what we thought we meant when we did it. I mean, that's not how a zoning ordinance should operate. And so we just disagree about this. I
okay,
understand
well,
that you really
in a
don't.
perfect world, if staff followed or they weren't directed by their bosses to do it a certain way, I'd agree with you too. But I've seen too many times where I was on the commission. We came up with it for this reason, and if you go back to the minutes, you'll find it. But now the interpretation is different than what the intent was, even if you prove.
Okay.
I
Well,
mean, so yeah, I think there should be the ability to say, on some of the issues, let it go to.
I understand.
the
I disagree with you.
commission,
If the committee wants to advise us to do it differently, I'm happy to do it. But I mean, I'll talk about it with staff. We've had several discussions about this, and
So
I
you're
understand.
changing our current code or recommending changing
The
what
whole-
the current code is.
Laura, there are many changes. They're footnoted.
understand
So, yes, you're right. It is a
But-
change.
But
Yeah.
throughout our code, it says specifically the director
That's
shall
right.
interpret.
That is right. That is true. I will tell you, when we had this discussion with staff, I said it's unusual because if you have a director that's in charge of multiple functions and he has an employee who deals with the zoning code, when you say the director shall determine, he's going to turn around and ask his zoning administrator, what do you think it means? So as a practical matter, it's unusual to give it to the director. So
And what would we have a administrator for if it isn't we must look at him as a professional to understand the code.
Well, no, state statutes actually states you shall form the zoning administrator position to enforce the code. Doesn't say to interpret, however, the cities are allowed to designate who they want to interpret. I prefer that when they have an interpretation issue, and I think this is how it was done in the past, the director talks with staff. And they kind of talk about what was the intent of this and what really fits. But if it's given solely to the zoning administrator, you get an employee that's on a power trip, they're not going to discuss it. They're going to make up their own mind and say, this is how I see it, and too bad how you see it, go take it to court. How many people can afford to go to court? That's where I don't think there's the fairness.
yeah, I understand.
The rich guy can, oh, okay, fine, I am taking you to court. I want the windmill in my yard. When the Board of Adjustment said, no, you can't. We agree with staff.
Well, but
And
the court,
then the court was right, but I don't think people should have to have money
the court
to
still
fight
is
it.
going to decide whether the Board of Adjustment was right or wrong. They're not going to take a bribe to make it to his. The question is, did the Board of Adjustment make a mistake?
And the answer was yes, via the courts. On that particular
On that issue? Okay.
yes.
All right, sorry, we don't need to belabor this. Were you going to say something more, Don? Or not? Stu, do we need to do anything more with the committee meeting here?
I got one question, I guess.
Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Is there a reason why we didn't talk about PD ordinance tonight? Plan development ordinance? Is it going to be a whole nother meeting? Because it probably should be.
Oh, no, we can talk about it more. There wasn't a reason. We tried to find highlights. We probably should have put a slide in there. Do you want to make a comment about it?
Well, I just know we've talked, there's been so much talk about it. There's been a lot of PDs.
Yeah.
There's been some stuff happen in the last 5 years and some stuff recently that I think it's an ordinance that's important
Okay,
to the development of a city. I think it's a good tool, but I think right now we've had some
well,
problems, and maybe it's not partially in how it's written,
Yeah.
partially in how it's interpreted,
Right.
partially in how it's implemented.
take a look at the way it's done in the draft. We've carried it over.
Okay.
It was, as Kristen said, right now it sounds like a development permit. Almost all cities don't use it that way. They use it as either a base zoning district or an overlay zoning district, and there isn't any right or wrong. We talked through this through a staff good bit and said, we intend to use it to modify certain aspects of the development, could be height, could be density, as Laura has mentioned, and leave the remainder as is. We don't want to rewrite the whole thing. We're not writing a new base zoning district. So we said, fine, we carried it over as an overlay. You did have the 10 different sub-areas with different physical,
Yeah.
and we said, we'd never seen this before. It
Yeah.
looks like you're really trying to, most places keep it. They are careful to define is it a base or overlay? Does it supplement or replace the other zones? What do we want in return for this flexibility that we're giving you through here? We can talk about that. And then they generally have just one version. If you see old codes, they might have PD commercial, PD residential, PD industrial, PD institutional. Most modern codes say, look, there's just PD. The thing is going to be negotiated. You're
Right.
asking for a
Right.
break. Let's call it one thing, tell you what it is. You go in, make your pitch, and you either get it or you don't get it. So that's the essence of what we've done with PD. We don't not trying to get rid of it, but we have tried to clarify and simplify it. And I hear clearly from Laura, she's not comfortable because it no longer contains the area-specific constraints on height and density that were there before. My personal feeling is, the attempt to bind council's hands to not rezone you in a certain way is almost doomed to failure, because any day they walk in and they're persuaded, they can amend the text, or they can amend the code, or they can create a new zone district. The guy could come in and say, since you won't be able to give me the height I want in this area, I'm asking you to draft me a new, I've given you a new Upper McCulloch mixed-use high-rise district. Please approve this. And there's nothing to stop that. Planning board can recommend it. It can go through. The attempt to bind council to never go beyond these lines can't work, because you can always ask council to write a new chapter and do it. So we're trying to say that's what's called PD, and let's put it in there and let the negotiations go the way the negotiations go.
No, that's good. I just wanted to bring it up because we hadn't really talked about it, and I know it's very important. I do agree with kind of how things were written. I think we're on the right track. There's some stuff there, and we'll probably get into it more just in terms of, how minor or major variances and amendments and those things are dealt with, going forward, and timeframes and stuff like that. I'll spend a little more time reading through it and get back to you with any other questions I have.
Okay. Sounds like the meeting's over. Thank you very much for we really appreciate the time you spent to go through it, and would appreciate written questions, and we'll respond. And we'll be back in a couple of months to add the missing piece of the puzzle, Module 3. Thank you.
Did I understand that right, though, in the height in those districts, the amount that's listed in the PD ordinance, it had like for approval of up to 90 feet or 60 feet required council approval. My understanding was if you took those out, that's the minimum height that's now allowed. There wasn't any approvals needed. Did I get that correctly?
I think that's correct. I think that's correct right now.
And that was never the intent, to let them have 60 feet outright or 90 feet outright. It had to be approved. So that approval's gone.
So it's 90 feet only in the Channel Riverwalk district. It's 60 feet otherwise.
Okay. And your point is that the 90 feet in the Channel Riverwalk used to require council approval?
Correct, because it was C1, which is limited to 25, so that's a huge difference.
But that, and my view would be, if that's something we want to put in, let's put it in the Channel Riverwalk. Okay.
I know you said it's over. All right.
Thank you all.